Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Now, as I read the text, I couldn't really help but think about Home Alone. Right? So it's one of my favorite so-called Christmas movies. If you have seen it, you know that the plot develops sort of right in the beginning when everybody is at the house. You have Kevin's family, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins, and all the kids are running around the house. And it's just, chaos, and they're getting ready to fly off to Paris for Christmas. And so in the middle of all of this, Kevin gets into a little bit of a scrape with his brother, Buzz. And he eventually mom gets really mad at him, and she sends Kevin off to the attic where he ends up spending the night. Now the next morning the family rushes to the airport, and they get on the plane and they're well on their way when Kevin's mom has this feeling. She has this feeling that there's something she's forgetting. So, did you turn off the coffee pot? And Dad says, "Yep, I remembered to turn off the coffee pot. But I didn't close the garage. That's it, I forgot to close the garage." But that's not it, right? Mom, she still has this feeling, she can't quite put her finger on it, and then it hits her, and she lets out this scream, "Kevin!" And so Kevin's home alone, right? So imagine Mary and Joseph. They're caught up in the chaos of this large family. They're traveling together on a long journey. Kids are everywhere. They've got that annoying uncle who's complaining about everything, and his wife is just telling him to shut up and just enjoy the trip. The kids are fighting over who gets to play with the baby lamb. The camel is running out of water. It's a mess, right? There's just chaos. And so Mary, she takes a minute, she settles down, and then it hits her. I'm forgetting something. Joseph, did you pack the dirty robes? Did you leave anything under the bed? And Joseph's like, "I got everything, Mary." And then it hits them, right? Together they scream, "Jesus," right? They forgot Jesus, right? Somehow or another, they've lost the Son of God. Can you think of a worse day, right? You have one job, protect the Son of God, raise him, and yeah, how hard could that be? Make sure he doesn't smite the neighbor's cat so he can show his resurrection trick, right? Stop parting the bathwater, Jesus. You can't walk on the water to freak everyone out, right? And for your Father's sake, please stop turning the water into wine. You know he can't handle his alcohol. So there's actually a gospel, right? The infancy gospel of Thomas that talks about some of these things where Jesus kills pigeons and brings them back. And so I don't know. Don't know if any of that is true, but imagine, right? You think you have problems with your teenager. Try raising the Son of God. But seriously, if you're a parent, right, you know how horrifying it is when you lose your child, right? Your child goes missing in the mall, they wander off, and panic sets in, right? Or maybe your child is older and they take the car out at night and, they miss their curfew and they're not answering their cell phone. And you get that feeling, right? Your heart just drops into your stomach and you don't know where to look or what to do. And it's just terrible. It's panic. And that's what Mary must have felt. She must have felt panic, fear, worry. Maybe she was overwhelmed with anxiety. And so they look, right? They look amongst the members of the family, they check with their friends, and they can't find him. So they return to Jerusalem. And after 3 days, they find him. Now, could you imagine losing your child for 3 days? Verse 48 says, his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." The text literally says, while suffering pain, we were seeking you. While suffering pain. So it just must have been a horrible, horrible situation for Mary and Joseph. And here's Jesus. He's in the temple, just hanging with the priests and the rabbis, asking questions, discussing the Torah, not at all concerned about having been separated from his parents. In fact, he can't understand why his parents are distressed. Teenagers, right? So he says to them, and this is Luke 49-50, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Now, that word house, there's some ambiguity around what it really means. It could really mean the temple, right? It could also mean the affairs of his father, and it could also mean his father's people. So we have these three things that are being referenced, and maybe that ambiguity is intentional, right? Maybe it's all three. Maybe Jesus is there, in his father's house, in the temple. Maybe he's with his father's people. Maybe he's attending to his father's affairs. It could be all three of those. But what's really significant here is that these are the first words, at least chronologically, that Jesus speaks in the gospel. We don't hear from Jesus any earlier than 12 years old, right? And we don't hear from him again until later on when he's in the middle of his ministry. So they're significant, right? They're his first words. They're significant too, for this is when he tells us for the very first time who he is. He declares that God is his Father. So Luke is not only relaying Jesus' words to us, but he's relaying this idea of who Jesus is. He's telling us that Jesus knew, even from a young age, who he was and what his purpose was about. He would be about the work of God's house. He would be about the things of God. He would be about God's people. But the scripture says that they didn't understand what he had said. So think about this for a minute. Just imagine how Mary felt. Right? She raised this boy for 12 years. She must have underwent a lot of looks and comments about, having this child out of a marriage relationship, out of a relationship, She must have faced some sort of jeers and whatnot about, having a virgin birth or, whatever the case may be, right? So Mary has undergone a lot, and she's endured a lot of suffering, and still she remains faithful to God. She remains faithful to Joseph and to Jesus. And so the two of them really, though Mary and Joseph, having suffered the anguish of losing Jesus for 3 days, having worried about whether he was safe, if he had been taken or harmed, they find Jesus and he says, "Didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house?" All right, so think about that for a second. Think about if your child had said that. Put yourself in the place of Jesus' parents. You're Jesus' mother, or maybe better yet, you're his father, Joseph. You've raised the boy. You've fed him, clothed him. You know that he's very special, and that this special life has been entrusted to you. You've spent 12 years sacrificing for this boy. You're his father. And his words are, "I'm here at my Father's house." So if you're Joseph, you're thinking, "But I'm your father." Right? Joseph and Mary are thinking, "But we're your parents." Well, Jesus might as well have said, you're not my real parents. This is where I'm supposed to be, with my real father, with my real family. So of course they didn't understand, right? They were his family, they were his parents, but Jesus is telling them, this is where I belong, even at 12. So, Jesus really is preparing them, right? He's telling them, even at this young age, he's preparing them for the moment when he's going to leave their house and step out into the world. He's preparing his parents for what is to come. He's letting his parents know that, and even in this teenage kind of way, he's letting them know that the day is coming when he must leave and make his own way. The day's coming when he must begin the work that he was put on the earth to do. Now, getting back to Kevin in Home Alone, right? Kevin has the same experience, doesn't he? Now, I should probably give up the analogy, I know, but I'm going to just stick with it for a little bit longer. Because when Kevin's parents return, his response is similar, right? He says, why would you worry? I took care of myself, right? I went shopping, I did the laundry, I took care of Marv and Harry, they didn't steal any of our stuff, right? So Kevin is showing his parents that he's capable of being on his own. He's showing them that he's growing up. And similarly, Jesus is saying the same thing. I'm growing up. My time is coming, and I'm getting ready. Now, of course, Jesus didn't have to fight the Marv and Harry of Bethlehem. But we know that later on in his life, he did have to navigate the traps and the challenges that were set for him by the Pharisees and the priests and the rabbis. We read in the gospel on several occasions of the skillful way in which Jesus turns their questions back on them. So, similarities end there, and we can set aside Home Alone. I was just in that kind of place, I think, when I read this. But if you look at the passage further, and you for me in particular, I kept looking at verses 46 through 48. And 46 starts with, after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Now everyone who heard him was amazed at his insight and his answers. And when Jesus' parents saw him, they were astonished. So it's easy to be intrigued by the fact that everyone was amazed or because Mary and Joseph were astonished. But that's not what stands out to me. What I find most intriguing is that Jesus is sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Right? This is how he comes out onto the scene. This is how he comes into the world. He's the one with all the questions, right? He's that kid. Right? It's cute for a little while. Here's this 12-year-old with all these questions, but pretty soon someone must have been like, who is this kid? Right? Where are his parents? Will he ever stop asking questions? But that's not what happens, right? What happens is Jesus is engaged, those around him are astonished, and everyone must have sensed something special about him. So if we fast forward 20 years, Jesus is in his ministry, he's in his 30s, we assume. And those priests and those rabbis, the Pharisees, they must have been asking exactly the same questions. Right? Who is this man, Jesus? Who is he to ask so many questions? Who is he to question us? What gives him the right? But this is what Jesus did. He questioned everyone. He questioned authority. He questioned the priests, the rabbis, the Pharisees. Jesus held those in power to account for what they believed and to account for what they taught. There's an example in Luke, it's in chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and the Pharisees, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. And then he said to them, if one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day? And they could not reply to this. So we know that the Sabbath was a holy day that was supposed to be honored. You were not supposed to do any work of any sort. And so healing this man was considered work. Pulling your child out of a well would have been considered work. And so Jesus is calling attention to a teaching here that's been taken to an extreme, right? It's a teaching that, when applied, really becomes impractical. It's not compassionate at all. It's not a loving teaching when you put it into some extreme circumstances. So surely it's bad to work on the Sabbath, but what's the price here, right? Should the sick not be healed? Should the suffering not be relieved? Should those facing danger and death be ignored? So Jesus sees this lack of compassion and love in the teaching, and he calls it out. He does so in such a way that those present, they must look into their own hearts, right? They must look at what they believe. They must examine their own conscience, look at their own capacity for love and compassion, and then weigh that against the teaching. So this back and forth with Pharisees, the questions and the challenges, they're not uncommon in the gospel. There are several occasions where Jesus is engaged in debate with faith leaders of the time. His questions and his retorts were always pointed, and they went right to the heart of the teaching. He pulled no punches. Where Jesus saw injustice, exclusion, or hypocrisy, false teaching, or even misunderstanding, he pointed it out. He asked questions, he engaged in debate, he proposed alternatives. Jesus was not happy with the state of the church, if you will, and so he sought to change it. Now, we're in a similar place today, I think. We look at the church, and when I say the church, I mean the church with the capital C, right? The church universal. I don't know why I keep doing this. We look at the church and we see so much that has to change, right? There are so many people who have left the church because of this, right? Because they have sought other ways to connect with God. They've looked for alternative forms of worship because the church did not meet some need, or perhaps the church taught something hurtful or destructive. For some, the church has become the enemy. The word Christian even makes them shudder, even though they were once Christian and maybe still want to be Christian, but not in the church they knew. Not in that extreme, conservative, self-righteous, bigoted, exclusionary, oppressive, hateful church that turned them away from God. They don't want to go back to that. Now, many of you know that church. You've been the victim of their hate and bigotry. You've been scorned and isolated for who you love or what you believe, or you were abused and made to feel it was your fault, or your spouse cheated and you were the one who was shunned. The stories are endless, right? Of Christians who have been hurt by the church, Christians who trusted their faith leaders and who were not only disappointed, but devastated by the misuse and abuse of that trust. Those of us here at Missiongathering who have experienced these things, somehow we managed to make it back to church. We managed to find a place that was many of the things that we expected church to be. Now, it's not perfect, as you've seen this morning, right? But it's what we have been looking for. It's what we needed in our life. It's the place where we can feel good about being a Christian. It's a place where we can begin to heal and to help others heal. But there are so many out there, outside these walls, who have given up on church. They haven't given up on God, but they've given up on the church. They talk about those Christians, right? They associate all Christians with those so-called leaders, who preach racism and homophobia, oppression, and the perpetuation of the patriarchy. And so when they hear Christian, they don't think of Christ. You and I know who they think of first, right? They certainly don't think of Reverend William Barber, right? They don't think of Teresa Hort Owens, who's the leader of our denomination, or any of the other leaders of our denomination. They don't think of people like Richard Rohr or Brian McLaren or any of the other sort of progressive voices in the church. No, they think of all the Christians, or better yet, they don't even think of those Christians who are fighting for justice and human rights, right? They don't think about the Christians that are at the U.S.-Mexico border helping those seeking asylum. They don't think of you and I. So they've given up on the church. And you and I understand. I think we do. We might even think, why shouldn't they feel this way? But I think they are wrong. And I think if we go back to 12-year-old Home Alone Jesus, we go back to Jesus in the temple, listening and asking questions, or we go to 30-year-old Jesus, challenging the Pharisees, pointing out the errors of their teaching. I think if we go back there, maybe we get a different perspective. Now, I understand the disdain that's felt for those, I'm going to do it again, those Christians, right? I even understand why some of us have given up on the church, thank you. For many years, I avoided Christian churches. I could not reconcile the Christ that I knew with the Christians I encountered on a regular basis. Was it Gandhi who said, what did he say? I love your Christ, but your Christians not so much? So I searched for a God that I thought existed, right? Not the God that they worshipped. I looked for a loving and a forgiving God, not a vengeful, hateful God. For many years, I couldn't even call myself a Christian because I did not want to be associated with those other Christians. But deep down, my Christian identity never left, as hard as I tried to suppress it. Jesus had left such an impression on my heart that I could not totally distance myself from this movement, right? This path. I couldn't veer too far off from that. So I found authors and teachers and other people like me who seemed to be writing about and talking about the God that I was looking for, the God that I knew existed. And somehow or another, I ended up here, like many of you. And so this place, right, this community, this church, you people, you showed me what the church can be, right? You are the church. And this experience, I want everybody to have this experience of church. I want everybody to be able to experience church as it should be. Now, I'm not saying that this place is perfect. We certainly are not perfect. This is a place full of real humans doing real life and having real experiences. It's ugly, it's messy, and at the same time, it's beautiful. As our founding pastor likes to say, as Rich says all the time, we're a rated R church, and the R stands for real. And that's just who we are. My desire, though, for all of those who've left the church because of what the church has done to them, my prayer is that they realize the only way the church will change is if they come back. They hold the power to change the church that has hurt them. Now, I'm not saying that they should return to the pastors and the congregations that did them harm. I mean, that would be terrible. But I am saying that if they want change, if we want change in the church, congregations like this one must grow and thrive. And the only way we can grow and thrive, is if we lead those people like us back to the church. We are called to be here at Mission Gathering, and we are called to bring others to God and to this place. Because we are the church. And we can be that church that each of us has longed for. Our friends who've been hurt by the church need to know that there's a place for them to heal. Our brothers and sisters who have been marginalized by the church need to know that there are churches that will honor them, respect them, and love them exactly as they are. They need to know that there are places they can go to that will listen to them and make an effort to be the church that Christ intended, the church that they had hoped existed. They need to know that when church doesn't meet their expectations, when it seems that church is losing its way, they can ask questions. They can challenge leadership. And they need to know that if they are rebuffed, they can move on. They can keep looking. Because there are places out there, like this one, that will love them and show them who Jesus is and who God is. They don't need to give up on church. God has not given up on them, and we have not given up on them. Now, my message is not only for those who have abandoned church, right, because they're not here. Hopefully they're listening, they're watching. But it's for all of us sitting here today, right? We can follow the example of Jesus and question our leaders and our teachers. We can challenge our church to be better, to live into the love and the compassion of Christ. If we have questions, we need to ask them. We need to ask questions of each other. We need to ask questions of our pastors, and we need to ask questions of ourselves. We cannot become complacent with where we cannot become complacent with where our church is or where we are at in our faith journey. Questions are not a bad thing. Doubt is not a bad thing. For goodness sake, I have so many questions. I have doubts every day. And it seems that the more I learn, the more questions I have. What I believe is that questions and doubts are essential to faith. Questions and doubts are the evidence of a living faith. The questions are the things that let you know that you are seeking God. They're the proof that you are trying to get to know God. The questions tell you that you are on the path, not the answers. The answers should only generate more questions. And it's this doubt that we have that's the evidence of our desire to know God more deeply. I mean, if you were to believe everything you heard me say or everything you heard Andrew say, and then you went home and practiced it, that would be my faith. That would be Andrew's faith. That would not be yours. So in order for faith to be your own, you must work at it. You have to ask questions. You have to seek and keep seeking. Never be satisfied. When you are satisfied, when you think you have it figured out, I promise you, you don't. Faith is a journey of a lifetime with no end in sight. The quest to seek and know God is one that never ends. So this is what I want you to know today, what I want you to take with you. As Christians, we're followers of Jesus, right? We follow the way. We follow the way in which Jesus lived. And in today's reading, we find 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, and he presents us with just a bit of the path along the way. He shows us that it's okay to ask questions. Adult Jesus, right, 30-year-old Jesus, shows us that it's okay to challenge what we are being told by the church. It's okay for us to point out the things that go against our understanding of the loving God we follow. If you know God to be loving, to be love, then anything you encounter that is not of love should be challenged and questioned. So for this to have any impact, though, for this to affect any change, it must be done within the church. We can't sit on the sidelines and criticize and point out all the ways the church is wrong, right? We can't go on Facebook and post, all of our issues with the church and think that that's going to do something. It's not going to do anything except make you feel a little bit better. but it doesn't change the church. If we want to have an impact, if we want to create a church that resembles the Jesus and the God that we love, then we must do it from within the church. So, if you're listening to this online, if you're here today and you're not happy with the church, if you're not happy with this church, what are you going to do? Are you going to abandon the church? Or are you going to change the church? I want to leave you with one more reading, and this is from Paul. And Paul wrote this to a church that was struggling with divisions, and a church where some claimed to follow this apostle or that disciple. They were the apostles of Peter or Paul. It was a church where the reason for their existence really was being forgotten. And Paul writes, "Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Jesus Christ, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." So this is who we are. This is our call. We are the foolish who are called to shame the wise. We are what is low and despised in the world, the things that are not. We are called to reduce to nothing the things that are. Not because God created us foolish or low, despised or nothing. That's not how God created us. That's who they say we are, right? That's who the world says we are. This is who the church at one time or another told us who we are, right? But the joke is on them, because it's you and I, and only you and I, who can change the church, and in time, change the world. So if you're listening to this, if you're here today, and you're not happy with the church, what are you going to do? Are you going to abandon the church? Or are you going to change the church?